Hi everyone, welcome to Mindgasms. Sorry that I have kind of a bad quality picture here. The sun's just coming up and it would have to be right in my eyes for me to show you my face like this here. So I'm just gonna keep these other tabs open for the most part for the visuals for this. But anyway, so as you can see from the title of this video, this is about Parmenides' argument against Socrates in one of Plato's dialogues between Socrates and Parmenides. And basically, Parmenides accuses Socrates of just using dialectical gymnastics, and that basically his grand theory of ideas that is really actually just Plato's theories of forms, which I'll explain later, just amounts to nothing but dialectical gymnastics because it works in theory, but not in practice. So anyway, this is going to be this is the second video in my series, as you can see, about Slavoj Zizek on Hegel, and particularly for the purposes of this video, this is on Hegel's Dialectics. So I'm doing a series on Hegel explored through the perspectives of other philosophers, and the first one, and I'm first going through Slavoj Zizek's book here, called Less Than Nothing. And as you can see here, Slavoj Zizek is a Slovenian philosopher, and he's somewhere in Slovenia there. That's all that's important for that, really. But he's also a Hegelian Marxist and a Lacanian, so he is really he's a really a big advocate of Hegel's dialectics and his metaphysics. And this only has to do only this part of the essay in his book called Less Than Nothing, which is about Hegel's aesthetics, dialectics, and other aspects of his worldview. This one doesn't have that much to do with Hegel, but at the start of the book here, he's building up his explanations to what he's going to get into. So what he's doing this one is basically, as I said, he's pointing out that he's pointing out Parmenides' criticisms of Socrates' worldview, which is really Plato's theory of forms that he ascribes to. And so basically, actually, I'm going to show you a picture of Slavoj Zizek here. I told you who he is, but he's a pretty crazy looking philosopher. You can see him here. He's well known for, he's a fairly well known Marxist Hegelian, as I said, and he's probably more well known to people for having debated Jordan Peterson about Marxism, I guess, a year or two ago, probably more like 2 years ago. But anyway, he's a pretty cool, radical Hegelian, Lacanian philosopher, as I said. And so he is, as a lot of people probably saw from his debate with Jordan Peterson, the common person's conception of what a Marxist is very different if you haven't actually read books by Marx, and Jordan Peterson only read the Communist Manifesto, of course. So, of course, people generally know who Marx is, but he was a German philosopher, economist, historian, sociologist, political theorist, journalist, and socialist revolutionary. Also, like, obviously founder of communism and Marxism that led to the Russian Revolution, and then eventually was one of the many factors in the Cold War, and so on, and everything like that. And most people probably know what Marx looks like because there are famous pictures of him as well. But I will show you a picture here too, just for those of you who don't know. Most of them are black and white here, as you can see. This is the only one that is a color picture of him. That's probably an approximation of what he looked like anyway. So anyway, as I said, oh yeah, I will explain who Hegel is here. So he's an obscure continental philosopher, basically, who has lots of really abstract views, and he's a very verbose writer as a lot of those Continental philosophers are, but he also has like really fascinating and sophisticated ideas and interesting ways of exploring them. So here's just the Wikipedia entry here. German philosopher, considered one of the most important figures in German idealism. Yeah, the idea behind idealism is that you're against materialism, but you're not a dualist. It's one of the main three competing theories in the philosophy of mind between materialism, idealism, and dualism. And materialism is the argument that everything is physical, everything that exists is physical, to kind of oversimplify it there. And then a dualist believes that there's a separation between the mind and the body, and there's a separation between physical objects and something like metaphysical objects. So consciousness could be somehow metaphysical or detached from your physical brain. And idealists think that basically everything, it's like everything, well, I was going to say everything is conscious, but that that things are not strictly materialist. Things are not strictly physical, but there isn't this division between the body and the mind and the physical and the metaphysical. They're all kind of basically the same thing. Actually, you know what? I didn't double check this, so I'm gonna double check the definition here. But anyway, one of Hegel's his most famous work is the Phenomenology of Spirit, which is considered like his magnum opus. But since he's such a complex philosopher, it's better to go explore his ideas through the works of other philosophers first. Here's the philosophy definition. Any of various systems of thought in which the objects of knowledge are held to be in some way dependent on the activity of the mind. Oh, okay, so I got that definition a little bit wrong. So everything is mind, basically. Like it's not that there's a distinction between mind and body as if you're a dualist, but everything is the mind. Like basically, consciousness is everywhere, and everything is consciousness. It's a little different from panpsychism in that you're not saying that inanimate objects are conscious, but you're saying that inanimate objects are aspects of the mind, basically. It's not necessarily a theological argument either. It's that really specific distinction there, which is why philosophy is so interesting, right? So anyway, to get a little bit more, as I said, Hegel, we're talking about his dialectic here, and dialectic it's not like literally dialogue as what you would think from the non-philosophical definition, but dialectic in philosophical terms is basically like laying out a detailed argument and sometimes pitting it against other arguments. In fact, most of the time you're lining up your argument and you're pitting it against another argument. So there's a cool picture of Hegel there, which is obviously kind of a cartoon, but I thought it was cool, and it looks all psychedelic and whatnot. So anyway, this book, Less Than Nothing by Slavoj Zizek, that's all about Hegel's worldview, including his dialectics and his metaphysics and aesthetics and other aspects of it. Like I said, the first video that I made about this was very interesting. It's about the morality and aesthetics of fiction. So check out that video if you haven't seen it yet. But anyway, this is a picture of the book here. Less Than Nothing, Hegel in the Shadow of Dialectical Materialism. So for the purposes of this video, we're not talking specifically about dialectical materialism. In philosophy, there's a distinction between dialectics and dialectical materialism, because dialectical materialism is more of a thing specifically to Hegel. That's like his specific worldview. And to go back to Marx for a second, basically Marx kind of stole that idea and built on it. And he he kind of manipulated it too, because Marx was a materialist. Like, he has this idea of historical materialism, and that's different because, like I said, he's a materialist, and Hegel was an idealist, so he thinks that everything is mind, but Marx thought that everything was material. But anyway, get back to the subject of the essay, like I said, it's Parmenides' argument against Socrates. So Parmenides, he was one of those ancient Greek philosophers. Um, that's his. He was a. He was a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher from Elea in Magna Graecia. So he was popular before Socrates. That means, obviously. He's considered the founder of metaphysics or ontology, and has influenced the whole history of Western philosophy, as many of the pre-Socratic and post-Socratic philosophers certainly have, right? And being the founder of metaphysics and ontology, those are like two major fields of study in philosophy, and there are all sorts of different types of metaphysics and ontology to explore that different philosophers consider and defend, right? So having invented the study of metaphysics and ontology, that's obviously those are probably just two of the multiple reasons that he's one of the most famous philosophers of all time. And here's kind of like an artist depiction of Parmenides there. And then, of course, we got the statues, which represent all of those Greek philosophers there. So anyway, like I said, Parmenides is criticizing Socrates in this dialogue, and it's one of Plato's many dialogues that he wrote. Socrates famously never actually wrote anything himself. Plato wrote everything down, and there's always disagreement about whether Socrates actually exists or Plato just created him as a character for that reason. So this is from one of the Platonic dialogues, and of course, many people have heard of Plato before, but for those of you who don't know, he's the founder of Western political philosophy. Most famous contribution to the theory is the theory of forms, which I'll get into, by pure reason. So Plato was kind of a rationalist, basically, too. And he was Athenian philosopher during the classical period in ancient Greece, founder of the Platonist school of thought, and the Academy, the first institution of higher learning in the Western world. And just a little note there just a little historical note there. After Plato's Platonist school, the Greek philosophy got divided up into the Platonic school, the Aristotelian school when Aristotle was around and becoming popular, and then or also known as the Peripatetic school, the Aristotelian or the Peripatetic school it was often known as, and then Stoicism. And then Stoicism ended up being divided into Stoicism and Epicureanism, and those two philosophies were going against each other for a long time as well. So anyway, like I said, Plato wrote this dialogue in which Parmenides is criticizing Socrates, and there are tons of Platonic dialogues. The most famous one, of course, probably being the Republic. So I highly recommend that and all of the dialogues, because they're really old, but they're also written in really simple language, and they're very easy to understand. So especially if you're not really into philosophy and a huge philosophy nerd like me who studies it all the time, you can really easily understand them, just like for the layman. So anyway, that's basically another artist rendition of Plato there. And you can see this statue, as those Greek statues are always there. And so in this particular dialogue, we're talking about Socrates and Parmenides, right? And of course, most people have heard of Socrates as well. But for those of you who have not heard of Socrates before, obviously, he was an ancient Greek philosopher as well. And he is in all of Plato's dialogues, to my knowledge. I think I've read most of the dialogues, and I haven't seen one where he is not present. Sorry. So he's kind of like a hero of Western philosophy, and one of his favorite lines that he supposedly said, this isn't a guarantee, of course, was that the only thing I know is that I know nothing. That's from the story of him visiting the Oracle of Delphi and then searching for the wisest man and finding that no one is wise, but the only form of wisdom that you can get is that you have no wisdom and have no knowledge, basically. So anyway, like I said, credited as one of the founders of Western philosophy and the first moral philosopher of Western ethical tradition. So basically, in a similar way to how Parmenides founded ontology and metaphysics, Socrates founded ethics and the study of ethics and morality. And of course, both of them were going back and forth, and all of the Greek philosophers, or most of them, were arguing about this. So these arguments that we still have today have been happening for thousands of years, right? Like 3,000 years or so, I'm guessing. But anyway, like those other Greek philosophers, like Parmenides and Plato, because they existed, if they did exist so long ago, you can't find an actual picture of them. So then this is just a statue of Socrates in the thinking pose here, and there are lots of statues of him in that classical thinking pose that we all know about now. So anyway, though, the specific theory that Parmenides is criticizing, or the specific theory of Socrates that Parmenides is criticizing, of course, is, as I said, Plato's theory of forms. So Plato's theory of forms, it's kind of the idea that there are these forms of objects in our minds. There are these perfect ideal forms, and like there's an ideal form of a chair, and every type of chair fits into that ideal form somewhere on the spectrum. There might not even be an ideal chair, but some sort of chair is more or less ideal than other chairs. So here's just the Wikipedia entry again. In basic terms, Plato's theory of forms asserts that the physical world is not really the real world. Instead, ultimate reality exists beyond our physical world. So the real reality is metaphysical. So this theory of forms is metaphysical. It exists above our capabilities of perception. We can't perceive it. So there are these forms out there that also exist within our minds, that all the objects and people we see in the world fall into. So we're not seeing true reality itself. This relates back to Plato's allegory of the cave. Of course, we don't see we only see the shadows on the cave wall. We only see the shadows of what really exists. And scientifically speaking, that's actually true today, because we have all of these cognitive biases that were engineered into us through evolution, so that we could chunk information in order to be able to run from lion without being able to notice everything that's actually happening at that moment, right? So the forms and the theories of forms are abstract, perfect, unchanging concepts or ideals that transcend time and space. They exist in the realm of forms. So that's the realm of forms is what I was talking about within Plato's theory of forms. He's talking about the realm of forms, and there are these forms, and everything that you see or interact with in the world falls somewhere in the spectrum of that ideal form of a chair or a cat or a cup or anything like that, right? So basically, like I was saying, Socrates, Slavoj Zizek is not explicit about this, but so don't take my word for it. And I'm not like a philosopher with a doctorate in philosophy or anything like that. I just study philosophy all the time. But he's probably very likely referring to Plato's theory of forms. So Socrates basically subscribed to that everything has an ideal form. And so, like I said, Parmenides is criticizing this idea that there is an ideal form of everything, because he posits this as a theory, and because it's a metaphysical theory, because the realm of forms is metaphysical and you can't access it, and it's impossible to get, that means it's impossible to get empirical evidence of it, right? So we get into it gets into this essay, this specific essay that I'm talking about, of course, Parmenides against Socrates, Dialectical Gymnastics, no thanks. That's what the essay is called, of course. It gets into Hegel's Dialectics as opposed to that, but not really that much in this video. But since we're talking about Hegel anyway, Hegel's alternative theory to dialectics, it's the dialectics, that the form of dialectics that Hegel is practicing, as I mentioned earlier, it's not the same as like the layman understanding of a dialectics, like a dialogue. So it's a term used to describe a method of philosophical argument that involves some sort of contradictory process between opposing sides, like dialectical methods. So, like I said, you're pitting two contrasting arguments against each other and seeing which one wins out. So you could say it's not Hegel's dialectics, but it's a form of dialectics in this dialogue of Plato between Socrates and Parmenides, that is happening, like basically that Parmenides is criticizing Socrates' subscription to Plato's theory of forms. And his argument against this is that he says that this is all theory, but it's not how it works in the real world, because you have not examined this in the real world. This is this classic distinction between theory and practice that again has been brought up for thousands of years, right? So I like this. I don't know who Manfred Eigen is, but I really like this quote to illustrate that point. In theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there is. So that makes a lot of sense, right? So Socrates and Plato are both saying that there's this, they posit the theory of forms, and there's this realm of forms in which perfect ideal forms of different objects exist. And so they're out there. There's a metaphysical place called the realm of forms in which these ideal forms for things exist. But no one has actually witnessed these forms in the real world, as Parmenides points out. So he concludes, and I think this is accurate, that Socrates is just practicing dialectical gymnastics because he's positing this theory, but he hasn't shown evidence of the real world, in the real world. So yes, Socrates was certainly brilliant, but like any philosopher, he can make easily logical mistakes, like every philosopher throughout history have. Even if they're like giants of philosophy, they all have bad arguments too, which is one of the great and interesting things about philosophy, right? Because no one is right about everything. So that's an interesting thing for intellectuals in general and people in general. No one's right about everything, but almost every philosopher at least has some interesting arguments, and maybe you agree with them about some aspects of their worldview and disagree about other aspects. So anyway, yeah. So in this Platonic dialogue, like I said, Parmenides criticizes Socrates subscribing to Plato's theory of forms, the idea of there being ideal forms of specific objects that exist in the world, that exists in this metaphysical realm of forms. And Parmenides is saying that Socrates' theory of this does not make sense, and it's just dialectical gymnastics, and you're justifying your preconceptions without offering any proof of them in the real world. So it may be true in theory, but it's false in practice. So anyway, I thought that was a really interesting point that Slavoj Zizek highlighted in this essay in his book called Less Than Nothing. And yeah, that's all I wanted to explain for this one. So I'll be making many more videos about Slavoj Zizek's video called Less Than Nothing. And it looks at many aspects of his worldview, probably all of them, as I said, and incorporates all of these other philosophers. I think it's really interesting, him commenting on that too. So we'll get more specifically into Hegel at some parts of this book too, but I just think it goes through a lot of really fascinating subjects. So anyway, yeah, look forward to my next video in this series of Slavoj Zizek's book on Hegel. And like I always say, thanks to all of you for watching. Thanks so much to those of you who subscribe to the channel. Click the like button on the video, share it everywhere, click that bell to be notified when I come out with more videos. Newest one is going to be on Sunday. I'm doing my next book chat with Dusty and Parker, two of my regular book chat crew members, about The Gunslinger, which is book 1 in the Dark Tower series by Stephen King. And also on Tuesday, I'm putting out another Mindgasms Tremor clip from my podcast from a while ago with Dusty about RoboCop 2. And then also on Tuesday, I've got a big podcast with a philosopher who has written a biography of Derrida. So we're going to talk about one of the subjects that I talk about all the time on my channel here, which is postmodernism and how public intellectuals get thinkers like Foucault, Derrida, and so-called postmodernism and their criticisms of it incorrect all the fucking time, all over the place. Like public intellectuals like Jordan Peterson and members of the IDW and all sorts of people get their arguments totally wrong. So anyway, that's what's coming up pretty soon. And like I always say at the end of my videos, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all. And groove is in the heart. And read the Platonic dialogues. Check out some work by Hegel and try to go into it. And also check out Slavoj Zizek books. Even if you're not a technical philosopher, you can understand a lot of his work. It really is more academic in some ways, but you can understand it fairly well. And I just think it goes through a lot of fascinating philosophical ideas. So if you're a fan of philosophy, check out Slavoj Zizek's book, Less Than Nothing, and his other work as well. And I'm excited to get into this book more and tell you more about it. All right, so thanks a lot, everyone. Keep reading fascinating books by awesome philosophers and discussing them. And their important time and all the important timeless issues that they always talk about, like I said. And thanks again, and adios until next time.